Okay, so this is the exercise number 2 which we are doing now. We'll be creating the pods, replica sets, deployment and services, and we'll also understand all the concepts. Okay, so what I have done is before the class I have done all the cleanup using kubectl get all will get all the details. Okay, and using kubectl delete. Okay, a particular resource name like pod nginx pod. I have deleted the pod. Okay, so the pod is not available, so there is a it's saying that it's not found. So we'll do it again from the scratch using kubectl get all. Check if the connection is okay. If we are getting the output like this, that means the connection is okay. Also check the number of nodes which we have and if they are active. Yes, they are active. Using -o wide we can check. Okay, what is the internal IP, the OS image and the kernel it is using, and even the container runtime it is showing as container D. Now let's create our pod, nginx pod. Okay, so kubectl run the name of the pod and image nginx, and again this image is downloaded from Docker Hub by default. Okay, if you are using some other Linux systems like RHL and all, it may ask you from where to download. The latest versions are asking nowadays from where to download that image, or set it as the default one, whatever it lists. But in this case it is downloading it from the Docker Hub. Using kubectl get all we can see that the pod is running. The pod is running, but how to access it, we do not know how to access it. So to access it we'll have to expose it on a particular service. Okay, so why we need service, that also I'll explain in some time. So what we are doing is kubectl expose the pod, expose this pod whose name is nginx pod. Okay, and we'll give the name to the service as nginx service cluster IP, and we'll press enter. And if you see kubectl get all, now we have, along with the pod we also have a service called nginx svc hyphen cip, that is cluster IP, and we can access this cluster IP only from this cluster network. As this VM is a part of that cluster, we are able to access it. Okay, now if we try to access it from the outside network, okay, which is not in the 192.168.1 dot range, it will not load. Okay, so if you want to access it from the outside network, what we'll have to do is we'll have to expose it as a node port. Okay, so this is the node port. So what we are doing is expose pod nginx pod, the name we are giving it as service nginx pod, and the type is node port. If we do not add this option, okay, it will consider it as by default as cluster IP. So earlier when we created, we did not define the type, it took by the default one, that is cluster IP. Now if you see using kubectl get all, we have a node port. Okay, but even though we have a node port, you won't find any IP for that particular node port. So what it does is it will always have cluster IP, whatever service it may be. On top of it, it has open a port 31695 on the node. Which is the node? This is the node. DevOps VM is the node, that is the worker node. This VM is acting as a working and worker and the master node. But generally if you have multiple nodes on the worker node, it will open this port. Now if I access it using cluster IP, I can easily access it. Okay, but along with the node port, I can also access it on a particular node's port. The node is 192.168.1.11, that is the IP of this DevOps VM, and colon, here we'll see the port 31695. Okay, so we are able to access it, and this IP will also be accessible from the network, which is having an IP address 1 dot range, that is 1 dot something. And if we access it, we can see the nginx page. Okay, so along with cluster IP, node port, We have two more services, that is load balancer type of a service and external IP. There is also one more service called ingress, but that will be on the top of some on cluster IP that we'll learn later. But as of now, just remember we have four type of services. Okay, cluster IP and node port. Load balancer we'll see later, and mostly used in cloud environment. Okay, and external means if we have any public IP, we can define it that access it on the particular public IP, but that public IP needs to be mapped to this VM. Okay, like if you do if config or IPA, okay, it should have an IP address. That IP address should be assigned to one of the interfaces here. Generally it is created using an alias interface to an alias. Okay, but as of now remember we can check the we can access it from cluster IP and node port. The other two ones are load balancer and external IP. Now we have seen how to create the pods, okay, using kubectl, okay, run pod. Okay, but normally we do not create only pods, we create deployment. So what is the deployment? I'll just explain it.
So
So we,
Prayag,
yeah,
so the actual server is running on the cluster IP, right?
yes,
And before Kubernetes, uh, it was just running on the physical server, right? I mean, before we install the
yeah, it was
Kubernetes,
running in the it was running on the container. Okay,
right?
and we were forwarding the port from a host to that particular container.
Okay,
If you remember docker run -p, we used to map the container port with the host port.
right, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so we are just wrapping up again. Like I know I might have asked the same question. We are just wrapping up the cluster IP with the node port so that
Yes,
it can be accessible outside the VM.
yes, correct. But
Okay, and
outside the
whoever,
VM, only in the range of the VM, that is 192.168 1 dot something. If it is in some other network, it won't be accessible, and also publicly it won't be accessible because these are all private IPs.
private IPs, yeah. So it
Yeah.
will be available whoever in the intranet, right?
Yes, intranet, correct.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks.
Okay, so we saw how to create a pod. In short, we created a container. Okay, now we'll see how to create a deployment and how deployment is different from a pod. Okay, so mostly we'll be creating deployment only. Okay, further in all the exercises we won't be creating the pods. Okay, but we should know how to create the pod as well. But we'll be creating the deployment. Okay, deployment at the backend will create pod only. Okay, but let's run this command. So what I'm doing is I'm creating a deployment called as nginx deployment. The name can be anything. I have given it as nginx deployment. The image we are using again nginx, and in this time we are saying it create two replicas of that image. Okay, just press enter. Okay, and if you see, if I do kubectl get all, it has created the nginx deployment. Okay, and it is checking how many uh, replicas we have defined. We have defined two replicas. How many are up to date and how many are available? So zero are available because it is still creating the pod. So whenever we create a deployment at the backend, it will create pod only. So why to create pod? Okay, directly create the deployment and it will create the pods at the backend. So what is the advantage? So if you see the replicas and all we can define. Okay, and when we see about YML files and all, it will become more clear. Okay, but as of now remember most of the times we'll be creating the deployment. The advantage is that uh, the self-healing nature of the pod is possible using deployment only, not using just a single pod. Okay, so what I have done is I've created a deployment and it done. I've defined that it should have two pods. Okay, and it has created two pods. Okay, and again to access it, what we'll have to do is we'll have to create the cluster IP using this command. Again I'm creating the cluster IP. using this command, and the node port using this command. Okay, so again what I have done is that for expose, I have now exposed the deployment, not the pod. Okay, the name of the deployment is nginx deployment. First I created nginx cluster IP, then I created the node port. Okay, if you write hyphen hyphen type node port, it will create a node port. If you do not use this hyphen hyphen type, it will create cluster IP only. Now if you see, if you do kubectl get all, so don't get confused. So that's why I've given the name like this,
Okay.
cluster
For
IP and node port.
deployment also need to give the expose.
Yes, anything we deploy, it needs to
Hmm.
be exposed, otherwise we cannot access it. If you don't have it, how will you access it, right?
Okay.
So if you see, now we have exposed it, and as always, these are the, this is the node port. Okay, is it the same? No, this one is the node port which is created for nginx node port. So we'll get confused like which service is for which deployment. Okay, so the better you use proper naming convention, or one more command is there, that is kubectl describe. So what I want to describe, I want to describe nginx cluster IP service. Okay, so it is telling that this is done for nginx deployment. Okay, the label and selector will be seeing about it in the YML files. So if you see, the cluster IP is for nginx deployment, that is this deployment. And if you see, the pod name is something called deployment. So the nginx deployment name will be automatically added to the pod after some values. So this deployment is for nginx, this service is for nginx deployment. And if you see, there are two endpoints here. Why? Because we have two IP addresses, two pods. Okay, this is pod 1, this is pod 2, and these are the IP address of both the pods, and there will be only one service IP. Okay, so whenever we access this service IP call, if you observe it, 1.183.150, this is the same one here, it is showing. If you access it, so we are getting requests either from this or this, either from one of the pods. Okay, because both are serving the same page. Okay, even in the production, what happens is, if due to some reason this is down, we'll be getting the response from this one. So the describe command is very important, and kubectl describe, anything we can describe. So if I want to describe this pod, particular pod, it will also give the details. So what is the detail it is giving? The IP address of the pod, 10.1.49.8. Okay, now I'll explain one more thing, why we need this service. Okay, if you do kubectl get all, we can also do svc. Instead of getting all the details, get the details of only service, or we can write service as well. Okay, so various methods are there. kubectl get all will give all the details, deployment, services, pod. If you want only service, use svc or service. If you want only deployment, we can see, we can write deploy or deployment. If you want only the endpoints, endpoints means the IP of the pods, we can use endpoints, kubectl get endpoints. So
So how would that IP assigned by default?
it is, everything in Kubernetes will be default, we cannot select it. Okay, everything is managed by Kubernetes master node, you can say. So what
Hmm.
we saw is
Suppose
kubectl get all.
some environment they use suppose class B, then how it's
So at the time of installation, we can define what should be the IP address range. But for
hmm.
learning purpose, micro creators didn't give that option to it. It has
Oh,
automatically
okay.
selected it. When we'll do it on GKE
So that
or
means this
AWS,
one
okay?
is meetable installation, is it?
Yes.
So cannot change anything, whatever they are defined.
Yes, whatever they have defined. But when we do AKS like Azure Kubernetes Services, there will, it will ask what should be the IP range for the
Mm-hmm.
pod. For the pod range we can select, but the cluster IP range it will calculate on its own, okay, based on the available IP. So it will check what is the host IP, what is the range given for the no pod network, and based on that it will calculate it, create the cluster IPs.
Okay, okay.
So if you do kubectl get all, we can see kubectl describe pod. So if you see the IP address is 49.8, and you remember container is by default ephemeral in nature, so that that means that whenever it gets restarted or recreated due to some reason, okay, the IP address will change. Okay, so we cannot rely on the change of the IP addresses. Okay, so this IP address will change, it may become 18, 20 or 21. Okay, but the cluster IP will never change. Okay, that's why an extra layer is given for the cluster IP, because pod by default is ephemeral in nature. Okay, that's why there is a need for service IP, and this can be an interview question. Okay.
Oh,
Sometimes
okay.
I ask it kubectl get all, because networking is very a bit complicated here, and
Mm-hmm.
understanding the logic is very important. Okay, so why there is a need for service if we can directly access the pod? Just try to do curl on that. Okay, let's see. If you do curl, it is giving the response, but this will change in future. It may change if it gets restarted or rescheduled somewhere else. Okay, it will give the response, but this will change. But that's why we need to access it using cluster IP or the node port. So we created the node port, and let's access it curl 192.168.1.11
168.
colon, this one I think, yeah, 30528. So it will always give a range between 30,000 and 32,000. And if you try to access it, it will give the output. Welcome to Nginx. So what else is remaining? Yeah. So describe also we have seen, and let's learn one more last command, kubectl get all. So you remember we used to enter inside the Docker container. Similarly, we can enter inside the pod. Okay, kubectl exec it interactive terminal. Okay, and here we'll have to add hyphen hyphen slash bin bash. Okay, so I think this command is not given in this exercise, but in case you are interested, I'm pasting it in the chat. Okay, it is almost similar to the Docker one. I think it won't allow some characters, it won't allow. So you can just take the screenshot if you all want. Okay, I'll wait for some time. And kubectl exec-it, and we are inside the pod, and we can run some command. Let's check if ipas command is, it's not running. So all the commands will not be available, but some commands we can run inside the pod. Okay, sometimes for troubleshooting we may need to get inside the pod. So the command is this one.
Okay, so